If we ponder who the most important figure of all time is, who had the greatest impact on world civilization, and who is the most remembered, we have to conclude it's Joshua ben Joseph, the son of Joseph and Mary, better known as Jesus. Similar to the title the Buddha, or Awakened One, whose real name was Siddhartha Gautama, Jesus is often referred to by a title, Christ. Christ itself means anointed one, like a priest or king of antiquity, anointed with oil when they assume their office, a term of respect alluding to his significance or spiritual attainment. Christ is a unique figure for contemporary people. Though we keep time according to his life, there's a strong cognitive dissonance about him in modern civilization. Western culture has been founded on his precepts for the last 2,000 years. Yet with the rise of modern secular culture, there's a confusion of what to do with him. While some contemporary people have maintained a rigid literalism about his teachings, others have responded by dispensing with him entirely. At minimum, we can appreciate Christ for his historical and mythological significance, for the literary legacy of the Bible, and for his cultural legacy. I think even if one is secular or atheistic, it's important to understand his influence on morality and human consciousness. As historian Tom Holland argued in one of his books, even if you have no religious belief, as a modern Westerner, your moral principles derive from his teachings. Christian ethics was a revolution in the world of morality, inverting traditional understandings of right and excellence. It favored redemption for the poor, justice for the suffering, and remembrance for the forgotten, the idea of love as a philosophy. Modern secular ideologies, including atheistic and Marxist ones, might demonstrate no interest in Christianity, but derive their understandings of justice from the Christian ethic. The most important element in Christ's story is the tale of his resurrection, referred to in the Eastern Church as his conquest of death. It's one of the most powerful, symbolic, and philosophical events in history. One of the challenges in studying Jesus is discovering historical sources about him. The scarcity of these, a result of his living in such deep antiquity, has caused a division between two schools of thought about him. Students of the historical Jesus, who seek to understand him from a grounded and secular perspective, and biblical scholars, who rely on and use references from Scripture to understand his life and his nature. We have an account of Christ from the writer Josephus, as well as a couple later references to him in Roman sources. Outside of these, accounts of his life are sparse until the later rise of Christianity. At the same time, this is to be expected, given the difficult documentation about historical figures, especially those of the lower classes in that time period. The main sources of the life of Christ are provided to us through the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the main works of the New Testament. However, for those who want to understand the historical Jesus, they present a challenge. Considered revealed or divinely inspired works in Christianity, they include many mythological and supernatural elements. In the 19th century, scholars subjected the Gospels to intensive scrutiny. They broke the works down, passage by passage, cross-referenced them, and tried to identify textual relationships and origins based on the information available to them. The first product of this was the idea that there was originally a work that compiled Christ's sayings, but was eventually lost. This work was a major source for Mark, the earliest gospel. While based on literary analysis, this work and Mark were used by the writers of Matthew and Luke. These three are called the Synoptic Gospels, those with a similar idea of perspective, while the final Gospel, John, presents an entirely other perspective. On reading the four Gospels, we find each emphasizes a different aspect of Christ's nature. The earliest Gospel, Mark, appropriately emphasizes his humanity and portrays his divine nature as a mystery. Mark's original ending concluded with the image of the empty tomb. this ambiguous conclusion constituting the origin of the idea of resurrection. Matthew was alleged to have been written first in Aramaic, the language of the Jews and Syrians of Christ's time, before being translated like the other Gospels into Greek. Appropriately, it emphasizes the Jewishness of Jesus, interpreting his teaching as an extension of the Jewish tradition. Luke, in contrast, emphasizes Christ's universality, presenting his teaching as accessible to the Hellenes or Gentiles. Early Christianity was originally limited to Jews, a subsect of the religion. Only later, with the writings of Luke and the Apostle Paul, would it be extended to Gentiles or non-Jews. Finally, John emphasizes the divinity of Christ, even making references to his pre-existence at the start of the Gospel. In line with John is the well-known icon of Christ associated with the monastery at Mount Sinai. Dating back to the Byzantine period, this image divides his face into two halves, on first impressions suggesting an amateur artist. On closer examination, though, it shows an artist who's very talented and purposeful. With subtlety, he portrays Christ's dual nature, showing his two sides as human and divine, natural and supernatural, constituting one individual. In ancient history, the Hebrews of the Old Testament established a kingdom for themselves in Israel. This state rose to prominence under the famous kings, David and Solomon, then went on to suffer great adversities politically. First, the invasion of the Assyrians wiped out most of the tribes of the Hebrews, leaving only the Jews alone. Israel was then ruled over by Babylon, Macedon, and the Seleucids, before the rise of Rome. Christ lived in Judea when it was ruled over by an ethnic monarch. However, he governed over a client state of Rome. Christ lived during a time of transition, the age of Caesar, when the Roman system was transforming from a republic to an empire. We explored this period in detail in our video on the life of Caesar. There were four factions who influenced life in Roman Judea. These were the Sadducees, Pharisees, Zealots, and Essenes. Each represented a different response to the country's occupation by Rome. The Sadducees were collaborators, political realists who knew the Jewish state didn't have the resources to break free from Rome. The Sadducees would be proved right later, when the Romans harshly suppressed the Jewish revolts, which occurred after the time of Christ, and the Bar Kokhba revolt, which happened under Hadrian. The Sadducees included lawyers and political leaders, and we can count Herod and other puppet monarchs among them. The Pharisees were educated religious scholars, experts on the Torah or Old Testament. They were the origin of the literary transition in Judaism, when the Jews were forced into exile and dispersed across the Roman world. Their faith changed from a ceremonial one to one based around the intense study of their holy scriptures. Experts in religious law, the Pharisees are portrayed in the Gospels as either dialoguing and collaborating with Christ or arguing with him in examples of sophistry or literalism. The Zealots were the opposite of the Sadducees. They rejected the Roman occupation of Judea and sought to restore the kingdom of Israel. While Roman power was triumphant, they were latent in society, though they gradually organized and gained traction among the people. They would assume power over Jewish society twice, once in the period after Christ and the Jewish revolt, which resulted in the destruction of the Second Temple, and later in the Bar Kokhba revolt. In the Jewish tradition, there was the figure of the Messiah, originally conceived of as a political leader and a successor to David, who would lead the restoration of Israel. While forgotten today, the rebel leader Bar Kokhba was interpreted by the Zealots to be the Messiah. With the defeat of their rebellion, however, this interpretation declined. After suffering defeat by Hadrian, the Jews were forced into the diaspora or exile. The final faction in Judea, forgotten in our time, was the Essenes. The Essenes were an ascetical, contemplative, and apocalyptic sect, primarily based out of the deserts of Palestine. While Judea had been taken over by Rome, they responded to the situation in a manner very different from the other factions. They sought to establish the kingdom of Israel in the soul or psyche of the individual, transcending the physical and finding fulfillment in the spiritual world. We have some knowledge of the Essenes from uncovering their texts from lost libraries that have been hidden in the desert. Arguably the two most important figures who either were Essenes or were associated with them are Christ and John the Baptist. Christ was born in Judea in the 1st century. He was born to Joseph and Mary and had several brothers. He was raised in the Jewish tradition, well educated, and developed a personal relationship with the divine. He spoke to God as a loving father, and despite his years of hardship and rejection, interpreted his life events as part of a divine plan. Like a mystic, he surrendered to his inner intuitions and accepted his fate or destiny. Several of the Gospels begin with a mythologized tale of Christ's birth. This doesn't exist in the Gospel of Mark, which, as the earliest account, we can interpret as there being no historical record of Christ's early life. Christ then becomes a follower of John the Baptist. Associated with the Essene movement, John was a spiritual teacher who lived an ascetic life in the desert. His lifestyle became the basis for the later monastic tradition, something we explored in our video on the Hesychasts. John preached to his followers and developed the ritual of baptism. This ritual symbolized purification and one's transition into a new state of union or right relationship with the divine. The term associated with this change, a pillar of both John and Christ's teaching, was metanoia. With the Bible as a source, we can infer that after being a disciple of John the Baptist, Christ started his own movement. Before this happened, however, he went into the wilderness, spending time in contemplation before returning to civilization to begin his ministry. Christ's time in withdrawal recalls that of other spiritual figures, like the Buddha, Mohammed, or Murden Well. The Bible includes references to John being a precursor to Christ, or of Christ surpassing him. This suggests that in early Christianity, there was a rivalry or confusion about the connection between the two figures. Christ calls the 12 apostles or disciples, who become his initiates. The Gospels include references to esotericism, something derived from the Jewish tradition. In the temple, there was the inner sanctum, an area that was only accessible to the priesthood, the initiates or elect. Meanwhile, the majority were only able to access an external area. Christ tells his disciples they've been given knowledge of the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but the public has not. Instead, when Christ teaches the masses, he does so through parables or symbolic stories. Christ's disciples include John, the apostle who loved him, Peter, who denied him but later became the rock of the church, and Judas, who famously sold him to the Sanhedrin. A central teaching of Christ was agape or love, for the divine, oneself, neighbors, and enemies. For those who are idealists, Christ's teaching to love your enemies constitutes a mystical formula. While hatred fetters us to the world, going beyond it and understanding we're all one represents a path to liberation. The Beatitudes, recounted in the Sermon on the Mount, explore the fundamentals of Christ's teaching. In them, he inverts the traditional moral system, subscribed to by people in antiquity. While it's evident wealth, power, and wisdom are virtues or goods, less obvious is the idea their antitheses might be desirable. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche explored the virtues of the Romans and Greeks, and compared them with those of the Christians and Jews. He argued that their moral systems evolved out of the social situations they were born into. Because the Romans had the ability to conquer, subdue, and govern, they viewed the values of strength as virtues. Because the Christians were oppressed, tyrannized, and silenced, they valued traits like humility, piety, and surrender. Nietzsche called these virtues those of the master and slave, though we might more sympathetically call them worldly and otherworldly virtues. Nietzsche had a sympathy for the former, though one of the ironies of his life is that late in it, after hugging a horse, he had a mental breakdown. This act of compassion may have upset his moral belief system so much that it caused him to lose a sense of reality. Thus, we should take a balanced perspective in viewing what has the most value. Christ's Pearl of Great Price is a brief parable, but includes much of the idealism of his teaching. In it, he compares the kingdom of heaven to a treasure, one that exceeds all others, but is incorrectly valued. In the parable, a merchant sees the pearl and recognizes how much it's worth, then sells all he has to acquire it, suggesting that it's so precious it could be traded again to receive anything. The parable suggests we should be willing to make great sacrifices and embrace apparent foolishness to attain the kingdom Christ describes in the Gospels. In our video on the quest for enlightenment, we explored this as referring to a higher state of consciousness, or to a state of immortality in the afterlife. In the parable of the sower, Christ compares his words to a sower spreading seeds that can land on fertile or rocky ground. In the parable of the mustard seed, he suggests that his words occasionally plant an idea in the mind of the listener, that these ideas, if fertilized and cultivated, eventually grow and bloom into a tree of higher consciousness. The parable suggests the soul can be cultivated within us until it becomes so vast it eclipses the physical world and can persist into the world beyond. Though Christ's view derives from the Jewish tradition, this idea has many corollaries, such as in the philosophy of Plato. In another video, we spoke about the siddhis, or psychic powers, associated with the yogis of India. Similarly, during Christ's time in the Roman Empire, thaumaturgy, the power of miracle working, was associated with and proved the attainments of saints or spiritual teachers. In the Gospels, Christ is able to perform miracles due to his possessing a dynamikos or power. In one story, a woman touches his cloak, and he feels the power go out of him. This is the one reference in the Bible we get to the mechanics of how to perform miracles. Christ's main gift is for healing, curing people of leprosy, paralysis, and blindness. He exorcises demons, perhaps showing he can cure people of mental illnesses. He raises people from the dead, most famously Lazarus, to whom he exclaims, "Lazarus, come out." He demonstrates other acts of thaumaturgy, cursing a fig tree which later withers, walking on water, calming a storm, and turning water into wine. If we review Christ's miracles, we can appreciate them from a symbolic perspective, showing how his teaching heals, redeems, and offers a solution to the problem of death. The most dramatic part of Christ's life is the tale of his crucifixion. After teaching in public, Christ develops a disreputable reputation for heresy or blasphemy against the Jewish religion. Causes may include his claims of divinity, his disciples' view of him as the Messiah, and his public demonstrations, like when he turns over the moneylenders' tables in Jerusalem. After suffering in the Garden of Gethsemane, he celebrates the Last Supper with the apostles. In it, he performs a sacrament, sanctifying the bread and wine as his body and blood, and tells his disciples, if they eat and drink it, they'll establish a connection with him. The Last Supper creates a tradition in Christianity, and it becomes the core ritual of the religion. After, Judas comes with the authorities to arrest Christ. Christ is then interrogated by the Jewish authorities and Pontius Pilate. He maintains a silent dignity through this process, only replying, "You say so," when asked if he's the king of the Jews. In some of the Gospels, Pilate seeks to acquit Christ and washes his hands of the execution, while the religious authorities demand he's punished. He's then made to carry his cross through Jerusalem, failing and suffering repeatedly, including being forced to wear a crown of thorns to mock his claimed divinity. Christ reaches Golgotha, the place of the skull, and here he's raised on the cross. Crucifixion is a brutal and simple form of punishment. In antiquity, it was reserved only for the worst criminals, or to traitors against the state. Christ becomes a pariah, and most of his followers abandon him, except for his mother and John, the apostle who loved him. Cruel and humiliating, when crucified, the victim's wrists and feet are nailed to the cross. In this position, the victim is forced to repeatedly raise themselves up in order to breathe. Eventually, they become so exhausted and weakened that they're unable to do this and die by suffocation. During his crucifixion, Christ dialogues with the criminals on either side of him, promising paradise to the one who repents. He asks his Father to forgive the people who execute him. He commends Mary to John, and when parched with thirst, is relieved by drinking from a cloth soaked in vinegar. In agony, he cries out why God has forsaken him, before giving up his spirit and saying it is finished. Some of the Gospels include an earthquake, a tearing of the curtain in the sanctuary in Jerusalem, and the legionnaire at the cross affirming the divinity of Christ on his death. Christ is then entombed, one of the blackest moments in the Christian tradition, portrayed in paintings and other works of art. In the Christian mythos, for example in the works of Dante, Christ then descends into the underworld over the next 3 days. The so-called harrowing of hell. In his raid into the underworld, he repels its demoniacal figures by radiating the power of love. While there, Christ abducts the figures unjustly condemned to hell, figures like the patriarchs, who had been condemned there due to being born prior to the Christian era. As we mentioned, the oldest Gospel, Mark, originally had a short ending, concluding ambiguously with the empty tomb. Later endings involve visitors, usually women, coming to Christ's tomb in the morning and finding it empty, or occupied by white-clad figures. Christ then appears to Mary Magdalene or his apostles, visiting two on the road to Emmaus, and most tangibly visiting the disciples in person and having Thomas physically feel his wounds in John. When Christ does this, he's in the resurrected body, an amalgamation of the spiritual and physical. The narrative then concludes with his ascension into paradise. One of the most important philosophical questions is what Christ accomplished. What exactly is the meaning of the resurrection? What does it symbolize, and how does it change the human experience? In the Orthodox Church, the exclamation Christos anesti, Christ is risen, is repeated on Easter Sunday, suggesting this was a pivotal, world-changing event. In the Middle Ages, the resurrection was believed to be a literal event, an individual physically returning from the dead. Yet if we interpret it from a mythological perspective, we can view Christ as a spiritual Alexander the Great. In another video, we explored the life of Alexander, explaining how he takes power over Macedon, builds on the legacy of Philip, and with one of the most capable militaries in history, goes on to conquer most of the civilized world. He leads an army to the far side of the world, to India, before returning and dying prematurely at age 33. Like Caesar, Alexander was worshipped as a god, the closest the ancients got to a god-man before the rise of Christianity. Christ, however, is even more ambitious than this. We can view him as a different kind of world conqueror, someone who transcends the interests of flesh, body, and nature, seeking to overcome them in pursuit of immortality and supernature. When we discussed Caravaggio, we explored the theme of flesh in his paintings. We looked at his depictions of grapes and bodies, and observed how he emphasizes the mortality of anything with flesh. Christ offers an antidote to this. His life, like a book, is a response to the question of death. The Spanish mystic Teresa of Avila, in one of her works, refers to Christ in occult language as the crucified one. This reference suggests a mystery to the human condition, that those who imitate Christ, who embrace a life of voluntary exile, rejection, and scorn, walk a hidden path to enlightenment. During his interrogation, Pilate asks Christ, "What is truth?" We've explored the significance of this quote before. Pilate's question has been interpreted in various ways over the centuries. Sometimes it's viewed as mocking or derisive. other times as philosophical or sincere. This is one of the most important questions that we can ask. Christ answers him, his kingdom is not of this world. If it's true there is a spirit world, then we should devote ourselves to the preparation needed for us to depart to that plane. This is the conclusion of idealists who make up history's mystical traditions, figures like Christ, Plato, Da Vinci, and Dante. If, however, there is no such thing, then we should be cynical and atheistic, and devote ourselves to strength, resources, and power, the goods of the material condition. The idea of mystery is a core theme of Christianity. While this idea has been lost in Western Christianity, it still exists and is a core tenet of more ancient versions of the religion. This idea has its origins in ancient Greece, for example in Plato referencing his experiences at Eleusis, and Socrates with the Oracle of Delphi. At ancient Greece, a mystery was a transformation of self that could not be understood with the mind, a ritual that separated you from the rest of humanity and made you an initiate. A central mystery, alluded to in works like the Odyssey, the Tale of Orpheus, and the Life of Heracles, is the descent into hell. In this myth, the hero descends into the underworld and then returns to the surface with knowledge or insight. We see this in the Aeneid, in Joseph Campbell, in Jungian psychology, and in the tale of Christ's harrowing of hell. This experience is then followed by a mystery of resurrection, the hero returning with renewed strength and vitality, having been fortified as a result of his trials. In Christian mysticism, Christ sets an example for his disciples to follow. The phrase that alludes to this is God became man, so men can become gods. In the contemplative tradition, this is referred to as the dogma of deification or theosis. If we compare this with Greek mythology, we can find an origin of it in the tale of Heracles. After navigating the 12 trials, Heracles becomes a demigod and joins the ranks of the immortals. The Italian poet Dante explored similar themes. In his work The Inferno, he descends into hell with his teacher, the Augustan poet Virgil. When the two enter hell, they see the great iron door of the underworld cast open from Christ's entry to hell. In hell, Christ abducts the souls of those who have been unrighteously imprisoned there, pious figures that came before him like the patriarchs. Hell itself represents the tyranny of us being condemned to death. With the door forced open, a heroic figure, a mighty one, sets the example we can overcome this horror of the human condition. In the Divine Comedy, Dante explores all the domains of the spirit world. He views the cosmos as functioning according to a moral principle called contrapasso, to suffer the opposite. If you are noble, wise, and pure, you will reap the consequences of those qualities. If you're selfish, cruel, and mendacious, you'll reap the same. In Dante's afterlife, the principle of like attracts like operates, that those with a similar psychic condition are attracted to each other. For example, the violent are immersed in a river of blood, with others who are like them. Being with those of a similar nature becomes its own reward or punishment. Dante initially tries to help the people in hell, but as they venture downward, Virgil admonishes him. He explains that God's justice is impartial, consigning people to where they belong, that their fate is a result of their free will. Dante's afterlife is an expression of idealism, the idea there is ultimately a moral arbiter of the universe. While you might suffer indignities during your life, you'll be vindicated in the hereafter. Dante's afterlife thus represents a logical culmination of Christ's teaching from antiquity. In our video on Shiva, we spoke about the symbolism of the cross and compared it to the image of Shiva Nataraja. We argued these were two of the most profound symbols produced by humanity, but given its ubiquity, we can conclude the cross has been the more impactful one. The cross has many meanings. It is a symbol of torture, reminding us of our mortality and the injustices of the human condition. The cross reminds us of the divine messengers, the forces of old age, sickness, and death. It affirms these as realities of the human experience and provides an antidote to them, the heroic embracing of suffering. In this capacity, the cross is a symbol of hope, suggesting that excellence, redemption, and apotheosis are a product of voluntarily accepting a life of hardship. In the mythology of Christianity, Christ's life is filled with rejection. He's rejected by society, by authority, and when on the cross, even by his own disciples. In response to this, he withdraws, living in isolation in the wilderness and talking to God. In the Middle Ages, this archetype of Christ was called the man of sorrows, and those who sought to imitate Christ, who wanted to achieve perfection, were expected to internalize the same psychology of rejection. This work, called The Christ of St. John of the Cross, was made by the Spanish painter Salvador Dali. It powerfully expresses Christ's nature. Dali starts with a simple natural scene, reflecting the humble life lived by Christ on earth. He then intensifies and elevates the image, in the process communicating several themes. If we look at Dali's painting, he takes the idea of mystery, in Latin the mystery tremendous and fascinating, and expresses it through art. With Christ portrayed from such a dizzying angle, we catch a glimpse of the divine perspective on the world, on the global, mythological, and historical impact of Christ. It recalls a figure who has ascended and gone beyond his humanity, someone who's attained a state of cosmic consciousness. From the conquistadors who conquered Mexico, to Constantine, to Charles Martel, the teaching of Christ had a huge impact on civilization. Looking at the everyday experiences of people all over the world, the poor, impoverished, forgotten, and maligned, they're taught that the moral teaching of Christ vindicates them, that the spiritual elevates their suffering, and they're offered the idea of hope through resurrection. John of the Cross himself was a Spanish mystic. Like Teresa of Avila, he was one of the great apostles of the inner life. While Teresa was famous for her work, The Inner Castle, explaining the soul's growth into a state of union with God, John's legacy was his work, The Dark Night of the Soul. This poem explored the spiritual seeker's struggle with feelings of suffering, doubt, and desolation, but how in overcoming them in the spiritual crisis, one enters into a new relationship with God. John was a kind of spiritual psychologist. Accompanying his poem was a long commentary, which unpacked his work and explained it in detail. With great subtlety, he explains the dryness, aridity, and sense of impoverishment felt by the spiritual seeker, while they're going through this process of purification and self-discipline. John was a contemplative for most of his life, though in his efforts to reform the Carmelite order with Teresa, experienced persecution. Placed in jail for his reformist efforts, he wrote his works on little scraps of paper, guided in this by his inner senses of inspiration. No doubt the pious John compared his suffering with that of Christ, viewing himself as imitating the life of a master. One of John's illustrations he made while in prison was that of the Crucifixion. Not an artist by trade, there's a gravity and profundity to the image, showing how a mature mind looks at Christ and his historical legacy. We find this same meaning expressed in Dali's painting. After Christ's death, the Christian tradition teaches that the apostles spread his message throughout the globe. An important figure in this time is Paul, originally a persecutor of Christians, converted after a religious experience he has on the road to Damascus. Paul then becomes one of the religion's great proselytes, opening the faith up to non-Jews. While Rome was a spiritually tolerant civilization, accepting and integrating the gods of other cultures into its pantheon, it ran into a difficulty with monotheism. The phase of the Jews and Christians denied the existence of foreign gods, and in doing so became politically subversive in Rome. This led to the Roman desire to persecute them. Certainly, the persecution of the apostles is one of the most significant events in the history of Christianity. Most movements in history would break in the face of such challenges. But what was unique about Christianity was that its proselytes were willing to accept self-sacrifice rather than adapt their beliefs. This shows the power of the Christian message to overcome death, as well as the revolutionary character of its form of morality. If we look at the cultures that embrace Christianity, we can discern some ideas about its place in human psychology. The best example of this lies in Russian Orthodoxy, which even after decades of persecution by the communists, proved resilient and recovered after the fall of the regime. Westerners are often surprised that the great literary and existentialist figures of Russia, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Solzhenitsyn, were pious Christians. Life is difficult and harsh in Russia, and even those of courage have little possibility for material happiness. If we interpret this, it makes Christianity more appealing there, as the religion expresses a mature understanding of human life that includes tragedy and suffering. This central theme is why Christianity has devolved into such low forms in cultures that don't have to endure the experiences of hardship. Without an underlying experience of martyrdom, we aren't able to appreciate the gravity of the Christian message. One of the tales of medieval literature is that of the king riding out. In the histories of Germany and Hungary, a great and mythologized king, after passing away, comes to sleep in a state of stasis in a chamber under a mountain. Examples of this include the figures of Frederick Barbarossa and Matthias Corvinus. In these tales, in a time when the country descends into an era of crisis, and its people need a great leader, the ravens cease circling the mountain, the king awakens, rising and leading his people to victory. This myth shows the resilience of the idea of resurrection and what makes it so enduring. The conquest of death grasps at something deep and existential in the human experience, and even without the miraculous, presents us with a vision of redemption. Christ's tale involves the heroic embracing of suffering, the acceptance of life in exile and withdrawal as a means to ascend and transcend the body. Christ presents the idea of mystery and martyrdom as a hidden path to immortality and the conquest of death.